I'm Joe Wolfe. I'm the Alfred Landecker Professor. You see the logo behind me, my corporate branding that I can do on Zoom. Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy, and the Landecker Programme supports Marietta's post as well. I'm a political philosopher, and I'm somewhat out of my comfort zone in thinking about issues of religion, but I'm always happy to learn, and it's a real pleasure to be hosting this event tonight. The theme of the seminars for this spring has been religion, populism, and democracy, which we'll be pursuing tonight. So today we're looking at the protection of religious minorities through international law, and how the structures of the protection is really quite complicated and decentralized, and how they impact differently on domestic and foreign affairs. And so we're delighted to have our two speakers this evening, Dr. Nazila Ghanea. I'm sorry, I should have checked how to pronounce your surname. Is that the right way? Nazila Ghanea, and Ambassador Stephen Rapp. Nazila is in the law faculty here in Oxford. She is the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook on Religion of Freedom or Belief, co-edited with Heine Bielefeld and Michael Weiner. And Stephen is a visiting practitioner at the school. So we're delighted, Stephen, to have you here in the capacity as a member of the school. And Stephen is a lifelong how do I call it, investigator of its interventions. He has worked on international criminal prosecution and genocide, and is really a very impressive figure in the field. So we're delighted to have the two speakers. Both will speak for 15 minutes. We'll cut you off if need be. So we'll talk for 15, maybe 20 minutes maximum, and then we'll have a discussion. And I'll tell you the rules of engagement for the discussion once we get there, but I think probably the best thing would be to use the raise hand function in reactions if you'd like to speak, or if you'd prefer not to speak, but to have me read out your question, you can put the questions in the chat. So without further ado, Nazila, the floor is yours, or the Zoom is yours in any case.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you all, and it's particularly lovely to be able to hear from Ambassador Rapp after this. Marietta, thank you very much for this idea and invitation. So you all have the blurb, so let's get right into it. So I don't spend more of my 15 minutes, but let's just say that hardly a week goes by without a top media story that concerns religious minorities, and also religious minorities and their claims in liberal democracies. So you all recall the story about the Danish handshakes, that it's the law for new citizens to shake hands, and if they choose not to, that endangers their citizenship. Perhaps you recall all the drama around mixed swimming lessons and no exemptions being given, and that concerned UK schools, or the burkini bans and the burkini protests, and the outlawing of headscarves, not the burqa, but headscarves for minors in public. And that was a story from France just a couple of months ago. So these issues and the attention they garner far outweigh the numbers of persons that they relate to. So I'm not claiming that these statistics are the most accurate, but what I found was that, the percentage of Muslims in France stands at around 5%. The percentage of Muslims in India, for example, around 15%, and in Netherlands around 5%. The Amish are 0.6% of the population of the state of Pennsylvania, and 0.1% of the population in Austria is Jewish, and 0.3% of the population in the UK. That's just a handful of examples, but certainly the coverage that the issues get is far the 0.3, 0.1, or even the 5%. So why is it that these issues get such prominence? Why are so many social and political red lines drawn up in relation to religious minorities? Are religious minorities inherently problematic, or does it say something about our societies when the contours of what is deemed acceptable so often maps onto the issues that arise in relation to religious minorities? So before we go further, we might want to clarify what we mean by minorities and what rights they are entitled to. And this moves into my comfort zone of human rights law. So minority is not, the definition given to it in international law is not entirely self-evident. And I should also add that the definition given to minority is not established in any treaty. So we have a default working document that everybody refers to, and it largely draws from the definition that was proposed by a subcommission expert in the mid-70s. So Kapatorti, who was a UN subcommission expert, said that a minority is a group numerically inferior to the rest of the population of a state in a non-dominant position, whose members, being nationals of the state, possess ethnic, religious, or linguistic characteristics differing from the rest of the population of the state, and who show, if only implicitly, a sense of solidarity directed towards preserving their culture, traditions, religion, or language. So of that definition, there's only one element that is contested now, but the fact that they are numerically a minority, perhaps that part of it was self-evident, but they should also be in a non-dominant position. So you can't have a minority population that is in power. That would take it out of the definition of human rights law of what is a minority. So the Baathists in Syria are not a minority because they have power, they hold power, okay? So numerically, a minority, not in a dominant position. Nationals of the state is contested now because others are also entitled to minority rights. So you can be a non-national, and as far as the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues is concerned, you certainly are entitled to minority rights. And in fact, her mandate even suggests that visitors are entitled or can be entitled to minority rights, except in very particular, in relation to very particular rights, for example, the right to vote. That might accrue only to citizens. And then they have characteristics they wish to maintain. There's a solidarity, an inner solidarity from amongst the members of that group to maintain certain characteristics. So you don't go and externally determine who is a minority. They don't have to be recognized in the constitution, for example, or the legal framework. They are persons who have these characteristics they wish to maintain. So that's the working definition. Where are the rights that relate to minorities established? Well, the key standard is, the key binding standard is Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And here it says that in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right in community with the other members of the group to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was silent on the question of minorities. It is in the drafting of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it's coming into force in the 70s, that then we have this binding legal standard regarding minorities. It's quite a cautious right. It's quite cautiously articulated. It talks about in those states in which they exist, which already begs the question, well, perhaps they don't exist in other states. And then it says persons belonging to such minorities. It is not articulated as the minorities as such being entitled to rights. And then yet another negative, shall not be denied, rather than are entitled to. So having jumped over all of those quite cautious hoops, then what is the right? The right in community with the other members of their group to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, and to use their own language. I think we should at least do the courtesy of recognizing that religious minorities are not only entitled to profess and practice their own religion, but in fact, culture, religion, and in fact, in some cases, language are also relevant. So when we're talking about religious so we've recalled that minorities are non-dominant, numerically inferior, and have certain characteristics they wish to maintain. We've recalled that the rights of minorities in general is upheld in a binding instrument in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 27. But we also in human rights law have the standard regarding freedom of religion or belief. And that is captured in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it starts with the word everyone. So even minorities, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Already this presents us with a new horizon, because it talks not only about religion, but thought, conscience, and religion. And when I've written about this, I've emphasized that we must also be talking of belief minorities, not only religious minorities. Because if we are taking guidance from Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, then there is this broader scope of, if there is a minority that has characteristics of belief that it wishes to maintain, then that too should be protected. So, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it emphasizes that this right includes change of religion or belief, but in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it talks about the right to adopt a religion or belief of your choice. And freedom of religion or belief is alone or in community with others, in private or in public. And it's not only the right to have religion or belief, but to manifest religion or belief. If we bring all of this together, what are the rights that accrue to religious minorities? Well, they have the right to their own culture, to practicing and professing their own religion, and if relevant, to their own language. And they have the right to declare themselves as a member of that religion or belief or not. They have the right to change their religion or belief. They have the right to practice it in community with others and in public. And they have the right to not only have it, but to manifest that religion or belief. So when we look at Article 27 regarding minority rights, it doesn't talk about how the state can limit minority rights. Well, perhaps because Article 27 is so cautiously articulated, it doesn't even talk about their, the ability to practice or to emphasize their characteristics in public. That comes much later in a declaration in the 1992 Minority Rights Declaration. But if we look at the protection regarding religion or belief, we see that already in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it talks about manifestation. But Article 18.3 also talks about circumstances in which the state can limit the manifestation or the expression of religion or belief. Before I go into the limitations that can be imposed on manifestation of religion or belief, I want to add 2 words of caution. The first is that freedom of religion or belief was given such prominent protection in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that it says that there can be, in times of public emergency, you cannot suspend freedom of religion or belief or enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief. Okay, that comes in Article 4 of the ICCPR. Freedom of expression can be suspended in times of public emergency that endanger the life of the nation. Freedom of religion or belief cannot. And secondly, when we look at the limitation grounds, we find that the grounds on which manifestation of religion can be limited is more constrained than regarding freedom of expression. So let's go into the language of Article 18.3. And why am I looking at this? Because we're talking about religious minorities in the public sphere in liberal democracies. So how does international human rights law allow or not allow those limitations to be imposed? Article 18.3 upholds that freedom to manifest one's religion or belief may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. So when we are talking about the niqab, when we are talking about circumcision, when we are talking about the burkini, when we are talking about swimming lessons, mixed swimming lessons for children, when we are talking about faith schools, is this giving any justification for the limitations? Well, it says that any limitations must be legally enshrined in a precise way. They must be applicable to all, or they must be non-discriminatory, both in scope and application. So if a law is crafted and it only applies to the Kara bracelet that Sikhs may wear, then that is, already discriminatory and it cannot be a justifiable limitation grounds. Thirdly, there are only limited social interests that can serve as the grounds for limiting religion or belief. And we said they are public safety, order, health or morals, or the rights, fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Interestingly, we see that security, national security is not a legitimate limitation grounds for limiting manifestation of religion or belief. And after being legal, necessary on one of these grounds, it should also be proportionate. So the sanction or the harm or the limitation that comes must be less than the benefit that is gained from it. So having said all of that, if we look more broadly, and I'm mindful of time, if we look more broadly at the rights, at minority rights, I have drawn together Article 27, the 1992 Declaration on Minority Rights, and General Comment 23, which is the interpretation of this right given by the supervising body, the UN Human Rights Committee. And I think it's not controversial to argue that religious minorities have a right to religious culture. They are entitled to group rights just as other minorities are. There is an emphasis on the positive measures that states should take to uphold their rights. The identity of the minority and their rights, General Comment 4 says, must be, positive measures may well be required by the state to ensure that they can enjoy minority rights. In fact, it says that the state has the obligation to correct conditions which prevent or impair the enjoyment of the rights guaranteed in Article 27. Religious minorities, along with other minorities, should be allowed to effectively participate in decision-making, not only in matters that concern them, but societal matters at large. And their survival and continued development is essential. So they should be considered an integral part of the development of a society as a whole, and they should be allowed to contribute to strengthening friendship and cooperation among peoples and states. Now, obviously, I've not tried to give a very balanced presentation. I've put all of the emphasis on what rights accrue to religious minorities, because I feel that there is a societal trend that goes in the opposite direction. And let me just give you an anecdote and a couple of points to end with. So in March 2010, I found myself in a panel at Brussels. It was an EU public hearing on freedom of religion or belief. There were 6 diplomats. I don't know how I got there, but anyway, everybody else was very distinguished. And the 6 diplomats, in their short presentations, each of them said, of course, freedom of religion or belief is an individual right. And why is it that all those EU diplomats 11 years ago were emphasizing that it's an individual right? Even the articulation of freedom of religion or belief itself, even if we totally ignore minority rights, it says that it is freedom of religion or belief is not only alone, but along with others, okay? And it emphasizes in public as well. So, how can we possibly read that to say that it's an individual right? But I think that went with a certain frustration of the growing, visibility of religious minority claims and the challenges they gave that gave rise to that in the European landscape. And I think the experiences of the last 11 years have illustrated that challenge only too well. Now, of course, there are limitations to manifestation, as we articulated. Sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes it is even the essential that the state should intervene to limit manifestation of religion or belief, or understood otherwise as manifestations that may come from persons belonging to religious minorities, okay? But it is not by majoritarian convenience. It is not to be constrained because elections are around the corner. Limitations need to be justified with care. They must be established by law. That law must be non-discriminatory. It must be due to one of the stated limitation grounds. It must be necessary for the protection of one or more of those limitation grounds. And it should be proportionate. So mindful that majority religion, I want to take the importance of this to another level, another guidance, let's say, from the UN Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee, in its General Comment 22, in its interpretation of the scope of freedom of religion or belief, says that even when there is a state religion, or an official religion, or a traditional religion in a particular jurisdiction, or a majority religion, they even say that even in those circumstances, that official recognition or state religion shall not result in any impairment of the enjoyment of any of the rights to others, okay? So where there is a minority or many minority religious communities, the burden of proof is on the majority, on the state to illustrate, to show practically that the majority does not enjoy any privileges vis-a-vis the minority, that there is no impairment or disadvantage that falls on the minority. And of course, here we're talking about...
I think we really should wind up in a minute or so.
Of course, yeah. Absolutely. So let's just conclude to say that we seem in many democracies and liberal democracies that should be even more mindful of rule of law and rights. We seem to have lost our bearings regarding our human rights bearings regarding religious minority claims and the grounds on which they can be limited. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So fascinating and much to talk about, which I'm sure we will get back to very soon. But before we do that, we'll hear from Ambassador Stephen Rapp. So Stephen, the floor is yours for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And I hope the signal is working, because I'm having a little hard time hearing you as you were doing the introduction. But I think you mentioned that, my own background is from a quite different place than that of many human rights lawyers, practitioners, and experts. I come to this area from a career in the law, in private practice and public policy issues in my own country, and then as a national presidentially appointed federal prosecutor, and then for 9 years as a prosecutor for the UN and for the Rwanda Tribunal and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, prosecuted the media trial, which involved the hate radio and the hateful newspaper that we alleged were responsible for inciting the genocide. Their leaders were. It was an individual criminal responsibility case, and convicted them. And then went over to West Africa to become chief prosecutor of the UN-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone that most famously prosecuted former President Charles Taylor. And then for 6 years was President Obama's ambassador at large for global criminal justice, supporting these tribunals, engaging to the extent we could under our law in support of the ICC, and pushing for basically the enforcement of international criminal law worldwide. Now you can question America's firm commitment on that, but certainly I saw that as my mission. And then for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been supported by the U.S. Holocaust Museum and continuing to be kind of an ambassador at large. And fortunately, I have this opportunity recently to be a visiting fellow at the Blavatnik School as well, and continue on the board of about 9 NGOs. And I've already traveled 50,000 kilometers this year, even with COVID. Dealing with conflict zones and atrocities in 9 or 10 different situations, prominently including religious minorities, the Yazidi in Iraq and Syria, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and forced by the millions into Bangladesh, the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in the Chinese autonomous province of Xinjiang. And quite often when religious minorities face violent prosecution, their first port of call is to talk about international criminal law, to say that there's a genocide, to say at least that there are crimes against humanity. And we need to use this body of law that has been created since Nuremberg and enforced occasionally to bring those who are depriving them of their rights, particularly the leaders that are causing it to happen, to justice, and by doing that, protect them. That has the law, the tough, hard law of putting people in jail, perpetrators in jail, leaders in jail, used for that protective function. And sometimes even in my own country, when I come to human rights meetings, people say, you know, you're not quite from the same place. Where we come from, we're interested in getting people out of jail. You seem to be most interested in putting them in. I will note that since leaving the State Department, and even before, to be frank, particularly because some of the ways that we could act in these situations to the Security Council, which we've done on Yugoslavia and Rwanda and even in Sierra Leone and Libya, became blocked by Russian, Chinese vetoes, and certainly there could be US vetoes in other situations. And so increasingly, if you wanted investigations on a multilateral basis, you would go to Geneva and seek from the Human Rights Council an inquiry commission to go out and make findings. And the mandates were written in ways that kind of conflated international human rights law with international criminal law, and also with international humanitarian law, the aspect of international law that relates to armed conflict, and talk about violations of each. And quite often at the end of reports, after making findings of a variety of violations, would be calling for International Criminal Court involvement, or for other prosecutions in the territorial state, or even by universal jurisdiction in third states, all in order to provide relief and protection when there had been these serious violations of human rights law. But just to get to the kind of the basics here, and I appreciate very much Naza's approach. And when she first confronted me with this, I had to turn my head sort of hard to focus, because in the United States, as you may have followed during the Trump administration, religious freedom became the preeminent human right, and they created this Inalienable Rights Commission, and frankly, my former office, instead of worrying about Boko Haram, worried about crimes against the Christians in Nigeria, et cetera. There was really this intense focus on what they called religious freedom. Now, I have questions about the sincerity or the effectiveness of what they were doing, but to some extent, rather than the religious minorities being denied protection, their idea was to actually increase that protection. Now, I think that requires us to get a little bit into this distinction between human rights law, which I know some of you are quite familiar with, and certainly Naz has done a good job in looking at the declaratory Universal Declaration of 48 and how that was put into effect by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the two articles that she mentioned. I would note, as she could note, that other groups have been given their own conventions for protections. I mean, there's the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. There's a convention on, the rights of the protection of women. There's a convention on the rights of the child, et cetera. And so we don't. It's true that in the human rights sense, we don't have that kind of level of protection of religious minorities. And you've got these limitations that are here, and some of this we could spend a lot of time talking about Uyghurs and Xinjiang, and if we had Chinese people here, they would be arguing for that their limitations on Uyghur rights were consistent with those non-discriminatory rules that they're allowed to implement, and quite often in France or elsewhere, the sort of arguments on religious rights usually comes down to, well, this is an equality and liberty issue. What about the woman who's being oppressed? What about children are being denied their right to the full education that they would have outside religious schools, whatever. We're trying to help people, individuals, and that requires us to sort of limit some of these old cultural and superstitious things that frankly hold people back. Of course, some of those same kind of attitudes are the attitudes used by assimilationist efforts in Canada or Australia or the United States against Aboriginal Aboriginal communities to force people into residential schools and sort of give them wonderful opportunities away from the country and their culture to do them some good. And now I think all of us are recognizing that that effort is fundamentally genocidal. That gets us then to that issue of criminal law, and when do violations of minority rights get us into situations of international criminal law? Do keep in mind when we talk about human rights law, even though we do have wonderful covenants, I don't want to ever oversell these things because, of course, as we tough lawyers call them, this is soft law. These are binding on states. Yeah, right. Okay, well, if a state doesn't want to do it, what do you do to them? You write up a report. And can you make them do it? Can you sue them in the International Court of Justice? Usually can't. Usually there's no jurisdiction created that way. Maybe an individual, after exhausting domestic remedies, can go to Strasbourg, to an International Human Rights Court, and get a fine or some kind of remedy. But whether that'll change the conduct or not, we don't know. And of course, that's in Europe, a little bit in Latin America. Other people don't have human rights courts. So actually enforcing these things is much more difficult. The criminal law, on the other hand, when we have a court, when we can collar the guy, when we put this together, then it's well recognized that this law applies everywhere. It applies to the head of state. It applies to putting people in jail for life for these crimes. And it applies even to things that happen entirely and wholly within the borders of a single country. The Chinese argument, oh, it's internal affairs. International crimes are not internal affairs. You can't commit genocide against your own people. You can't commit crimes against humanity against your own people. Well, what are genocide? What is genocide? What is crimes against humanity? And I should note also, we talk about war crimes. I mean, genocide does involve an attempt to destroy a specific group, which includes a religious group, doesn't include a political group, doesn't include a cultural group, doesn't include a linguistic group, but a religious group, but does also include, of course, ethnic and national groups, to destroy them in whole or part. And that destruction can be done a number of ways, most prominently, like in the Holocaust or in the churchyards where 800,000 people were hacked to death in Rwanda, through physical violence and destruction, but can also be done through other serious injuries, such as sexual violence, which has the effect of destroying the group, and can occur even in ways that don't kill anybody. The forced sterilization, forced adoptions, things like that diminish the group. On the other hand, tearing down the mosques sounds like genocide. Not. That's cultural. It's not attacking and destroying the individual, even though they have no place perhaps to worship their religion. And of course, we get into these situations with the Uyghurs most recently, and certainly prominently with the Rohingya, where our friends like Bill Shavis go to the International Court of Justice, or write articles say, not a genocide, you know. This is politically motivated. It's not an effort to destroy the group. Look at the population that's still there. I mean, they're maybe living someplace else, but the international criminal courts have recognized that just pushing people across a border isn't genocide. That's forced displacement, which can be a crime against humanity or a war crime. If it's not genocide, it can be a crime against humanity. And what are they? They're basically attacks against the civilian population on a widespread or systematic basis. And genocide has only been with us since 1948, when the Nazis were charged for the Holocaust. They were essentially charged with crimes against humanity, and really in a form that we call the crime against humanity of persecution. Crimes against humanity are all these violent acts that occur, but when you can show that they're specifically motivated by religion, by nationality, et cetera, but also political, which is quite relevant in the Syrian and in the context where people are shooting down protesters in the street, that they're the same ethnicity, those can be crimes against humanity. But clearly, for those of us in the criminal law, and you know, when you attack a religious minority and you attempt to diminish it, its population, so to speak, through these acts, you've got something very serious, and you've got something a whole lot more serious than when you act against a lot of other groups. So in that sense, we do have that more robust protection, and of course we have cases potentially going forward in international criminal courts on some of these situations, though obviously the one in China is much more challenging because of China's ability to block investigations with the votes of countries that support it at the Human Rights Council, its ability to veto anything at the Security Council, its non-ratification of the ICC. But just because there's not a court doesn't mean the crime's not being committed. And since there's no statute of limitations on these things, and there's third country jurisdiction potentially for genocide, if a perpetrator turns up in Argentina or you know, let's say Germany, Britain is more limited, they could potentially be prosecuted for these crimes. Anyway, I could go on to talk about the distinctions here. There's a lot of other interesting factors. I should point out that in the war crimes context, attacking a church, destroying a church as in a part of a conflict, saying, oh, there are a bunch of Muslims that we're up against, the group is all using mosque occasionally, but that mosque isn't being used at the moment for a military target, but they'll use it again. If you bomb a mosque, you bomb a church, that can be a war crime because that's a facility dedicated to religion. So you can have a war crime against those kinds of things. But generally, in international criminal law, you're talking about violent deprivations of rights, and we have to recognize that, you know, the right to life, the right to personal dignity are fundamental human rights guaranteed to us in all sorts of ways, and the deprivation of that is the most serious. But the human rights law encompasses a lot of other rights that we have as individuals, the deprivation of which is unfortunate, perhaps illegal under international human rights law, but the person who does it to you can't be prosecuted in any international court unless it meets these sort of violent requirements of the international criminal law and fits within genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. And we will take questions. As I said before, you can either raise your hand in the reaction box or put something in. Apologize for my unstable internet. Bad internet day for me. But we already have a question from Federica. So Federica, would you like to come onto the camera and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, John. First of all, I wanted to thank both Ambassador Rapp and Nazila for their very insightful presentations. As a lawyer, this is the stuff of dreams, these type of workshops. So in any case, my question was for Nazila, and I was reflecting, you made a qualitative difference, you emphasized the difference between freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And it got me thinking, why is it did I read too much into it, or why is it that you emphasize the qualitative difference? And how much more expansive is the concept of freedom of belief as opposed to freedom of religion, for example? And if I can ask provocatively, maybe, do you see a risk at all that certain type of worshiping outside of organized religions, so as I say in my comment, maybe on political grounds, could ever qualify as freedom of belief? And if not, why not? Thank you.
So I think it's not for human rights law to be determining the contours of what is a religion and what is a belief. I'm sorry if it came across as a qualitative difference. Instead, what I wanted to emphasize is the broad scope of the freedom. And so, you know, this is partly due to the Cold War context of the drafting, that, you know, the communist states were not too, you know, did not find favor with freedom of religion. And for that reason, in the drafting, it had to be broadened to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But I think that has been hugely advantageous and is more human rights centered, because, you know, at the national level, some constitutions or some states list a limited number of recognized religions. And therefore, they would like to argue that only those claimants have, you know, are beneficiaries of freedom of religion or belief. And this, of course, can be hugely manipulative and exclusionary to those that need it most, because, you know, if you draw the contours to those that already enjoy it or are the majority religion or the recognized religions, then everybody else falls by the wayside. So I think it is much more beneficial that it's broader. So the international standards have emphasized that this can be atheistic, non-theistic, or theistic beliefs, or polytheistic beliefs. So it is not the role of law to be determining what is religion. And the international, you know, the UN special rapporteurs and the UN Human Rights Committee have been very critical of those that have said that, you know, religion requires belief in A, B, and C, and all others are not beneficiaries of this right. And in any case, human rights law is not saying what is a religion at most, or belief. What they are saying is who is a beneficiary of this article. So in the European context, pacifism, veganism, those climate change activists have been deemed to be beneficiaries of the Article 9 protection. That doesn't mean veganism is being recognized as a religion as such. It's saying that a vegan who has a certain seriousness, coherence, and cogency to their belief is a beneficiary of Article 9 and should be able to avail themselves of the rights that are protected there. So certainly the demarcation for me, what I was trying to emphasize is that Article 27 recognizes religious minorities. Article 18 says religion, thought, and conscience should be broadly construed. So when we are trying to bring the two together to identify religious minorities, I was saying that we should benefit from Article 18 and say that those that have a certain cogency and seriousness and wish to practice with others are also minorities, because the scope of religion or belief is broader. So although the language of the minority rights provisions only talks specifically of religion and religious minorities, I think that we should understand it to include belief as well. So they can be atheistic, they can be non-theistic.
I should say, from my point of view, we in the criminal law have it easier in this respect. We take the view of the perpetrator. It's a subjective test. I mean, you can always debate, you know, were the Germans going after the Jews racially or religiously? And obviously they were killing many secular and non-observing Jews, and it seemed almost racial. But they defined it as such under the Nuremberg law. They had a lot of craziness in their racial theory that didn't make any sense. But if that's what they followed, and that's what they were motivated by, was the destruction of this religious minority, this destruction of this national minority, then Then if they did it after 1948, it would have been a genocide, and clearly it was a crime against humanity, a persecution. So that's how we deal with these questions, and we don't allow them to come in and say, oh, well, we killed a bunch of people, but after all, they're really not real people. They're just like the rest of us, and they were just political enemies. Now, that doesn't work. If you were essentially describing them by their small noses, as they describe Tutsis, by these sort of racial characteristics, or by their religion or their clothing, et cetera, then and that's what was allowing you to pick them and choose them as victims. You have that showing of that racial or ethnic destruction motivation that's necessary for either crime.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll go to Alexis. Alexis, would you like to ask your question?
I was wondering whether there's a precedent or a test for this criterion of being a non-dominant group, because it seems that there's certain cases in which that's pretty obvious. In other cases, especially perhaps in increasingly secularized societies, traditionally dominant groups seem to perhaps be more and more looking like minorities. If we think, for example, of the increasing disjunction between certain traditional normative structures and the dominant norms within Western European societies as they're inscribed in law, there seems to be perhaps a shift there. And so I was wondering whether there's some sort of objective test there to see who should count as a minority and who shouldn't.
So there's a couple of interesting things from the UN Human Rights Committee, that is the adjudicating body, if you like, for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. One thing that they've emphasized is that numerically non-dominant means in the borders of that jurisdiction. So not in that city, not in that province, not in that region, which has huge implications. And they may change their interpretation over time, but they haven't yet. Non-dominant, they haven't gone and said media dominance, cultural dominance, different spheres. It has meant political power. And I don't know if any of jurisprudence that has tried to go beyond that. But I mean, it can get much more detailed than that and change the parameters. But after all, we are talking about states that have ratified the covenant, and therefore the borders and the jurisdiction of that state as a whole, and dominance primarily relating to state power, political power, perhaps is relevant. Chris may correct me on this, Professor Stone.
Well, Chris is due to come in any case. So Chris, why don't you join?
No, sure. Thank you. And thank you both for this. I guess I was going to, I'm going to try, maybe this is you're trying to actually try to understand the connection between the two, Nazila, your presentations and Stephen's. If our subject is the gaps and cracks in international law around the protection of religious minorities, at least as I understand the discussion today, Nazila, you're arguing that there are a series of these gaps and cracks and sort of interpretive problems. And implicitly, you're arguing that those matter. And I understand Stephen's point. It's that they don't matter because you're talking about law that has no ability to be protected, to protect anybody anyway. And if you just looked at serious hard law, the kind that Stephen practices, the sort of criminal law, there are no gaps and cracks. We know what we're doing. And when you go after a religious minority, we can get you eventually somewhere, even if there's no court at the moment.
Keep in mind, that's only for the violent ones. We're not talking about headscarves here.
Okay, all right. But but is that, I'm trying to, have we got a, do you two disagree? Is it the relevance of the what is there a disagreement between the two of you, or are you just talking about different questions, different areas of law, and so there's no particular overlap? But maybe you could say a word about each other's argument. Maybe that would help.
You obviously want us to have a disagreement, so let's try, Stephen.
Well, it sounded,
well, I don't
like...
intend to have a disagreement, and I don't want to be so dismissive of human rights law, and I want rights protected, and I want to find more robust ways to do it, and I want human rights court. I want the U.S. and the InterAmerican Court. I want a human rights court in Asia. I want one that actually has a few countries that ratified it in Africa. You know, I mean, it would be. This is an important, a very important thing. It is, I think, in this case where we actually have physical destruction, that in that situation where we have a religious minority or these sort of discriminatory actions, I think we've got some clarity. But obviously, when we talk about other deprivations that are less serious than the physical destruction or the violent injury, then indeed you begin to see these distinctions and understand. All of us could. I mean, I had it occasionally when I would deal with in Africa in situations where people would say, well, why don't you work with the traditional courts here? Well, the traditional court will say, murder a woman, pay 9 cows, murder a man, pay 40 cows, you know, et cetera. Well, that's their tradition, and we need to uphold that. No, you know, there are sometimes problems when we put into the enforcement of law things that come from particular religions or which draw out of culture, you know, where men can have 4 wives and different things like this. And so to some extent, I understand the need to balance in a non-discriminatory way, headscarves for nobody, you know, that kind of approach can be right, though it seems as a policy matter excessive to me. And to have such a particularized impact that I'm disturbed about that one, and I don't think that'd be upheld in America, to be frank. And not that America's a paragon in these areas, but on the religious freedom issue, they're probably much better than Europe. So I do think that there is a need to distinguish the religious minority from the ethnic minority when we deal with aspects of that culture that undermine some sort of fundamental equality issues. But in saying that, I want to be very careful because, as I noted earlier, when it comes to the Chinese, you know, they had a Communist Party leader at the end of the year when these information came out about the descending birth rate for the Uyghurs, which, to my mind, was sort of proof that we had biological destruction and had a threshold case of genocide. A female official said, look what we've done. Those Uyghur women no longer have to be baby making machines, etc. And so they were, and what you see constantly in the sort of Chinese approach is their authoritarian system, which violates human rights in a lot of respects. They're saying, oh, we're just applying the same kind of standards here that we've applied everywhere else in China, and they're just yelping because we're doing it to them finally, you know, and that's not genocide. And so it's possible that those kinds of things that do sort of come along and on the grounds of equality run up against religion can even rise to the level of genocidal action, and that's why I want to be very, very cautious about efforts to chip away at minority rights, even in the interests of equal rights.
Okay, so Naz, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, as Ambassador Rapp was saying, so if we wait until it is genocidal or pre-genocidal, we have lost many discriminations and violations on the way. It doesn't mean that a general intolerance towards religious minorities means that it will necessarily become a genocide or head towards, you know, those kind of crimes. But it certainly doesn't help when, for example, in Xinjiang, it's been a story of decades, you know, forbidding people from fasting, forbidding the beard, forbidding the headscarf, changing the population. It takes many decades of effort often, and many violations of freedom of religion or belief before something then escalates to that level of gravity. And the unfortunate thing about freedom of religion or belief is that it's not even a treaty. In the early 1960s, the UN General Assembly instructed a drafting of an international binding instrument on racial and religious discrimination. but the religious element was so controversial, even in the 60s, let's imagine what it would be like now, that the race discrimination was quickly drafted from in 1963, became the first UN treaty body in 1965. And to date, we don't have a single binding instrument that relates to freedom of religion or belief. And for none of this, am I saying that it should be some kind of superior right? I'm just saying, as one of the rights amongst all other human rights, indivisible, interrelated, that this cannot it hasn't been enshrined in a treaty. I also think there is a link between the regular violations, if you like, of freedom of religion or belief and the international crimes in terms of the sense of grievance and the terminology that NGOs and groups sometimes use, that the term persecution and religious persecution is used very readily by aggrieved minorities. And I think more understanding across criminal law and human rights law and more precision about these terminologies is hugely beneficial. And just very briefly, something that came up in our chat when Marietta brought us together before this seminar was in relation to the extent to which religious freedom advocacy is becoming now an advocacy of states in other countries and not looking domestically at their own practice. You know, are they doing the maximum in their liberal democracy to advance the sense of, you know, voices being heard, everybody contributing to the culture, being consulted in matters that concern them, and sometimes having their manifestations limited, of course. So, you know, maybe that's another link between them.
So I think
U.S. exceptionalism. Yes, I was monitoring a trial last week in New York, and the Federalist Society came up to me and said, "You're monitoring under international human rights law. Don't you know that doesn't apply here?" Anyway, so there was that.
So I think you've both raised the question that Marietta was going to push to you, and so Marietta, do you want to come in to push a bit further?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nazila, for your presentation. I think it's really important that we get the legal facts right, because often people who study religious freedom don't necessarily study this as lawyers. So I think that is a good starting point. I think one of the things I would like to hear more about is the relationship between the domestic protection of religious freedom and foreign advocacy, particularly because in Europe, under the influence of populism, right-wing populism in particular, which is one of the themes of this seminar, we see a hardening of the debates when it comes to religious minorities, and in particular, of course, Muslim minorities in Europe. So my question is, how do you see this hardening of the debate reflected in international relations? Like, what are the consequences, maybe even the limitations that might arise from a more restrictive attitude to religious freedom in some of these European countries?
You know, I would say only from the point of view of one's ability to influence and have an impact internationally, which is something that I care a lot about if you're dealing with Yazidis or Uyghurs or Rohingya. If in your own country you've handled things in a discriminatory fashion, then you'll find your own conduct thrown back at you, and you'll be much less influential, and you know, it'll be viewed as a double standard. You may have noticed that the Chinese actually a couple of days ago said, well, one of the reasons they targeted Uyghurs is the U.S. had arrested Uyghurs on the battlefield in the war on terror and had taken a number to Guantanamo. And we're just doing it in a whole lot nicer way, et cetera. So, I mean, you know, obviously a horrible thing that the US did, and the Uyghurs were generally among the first to be released, though it was often hard to find countries that you could send them to because China was so angry when anyone accepted them. But it is just an example of how one's effectiveness in dealing with the most serious violations of really lethal violence and torture and sexual violence against religious minorities becomes much more difficult globally if you're not following these laws, and if you're particularly handling immigration and other issues on a discriminatory basis, particularly against Muslims who are so often the victims of these international crimes.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
so
go ahead.
I was going to say, Naz, if you'd like to also add something, you're very welcome.
I'll be very brief. So I totally agree with Stephen. And it's not only when you violate rights, it's also the perception. Okay, so you need to be seen to be respecting it. So because obviously in social media, etc., these things will be exaggerated. And I think it can hollow out your effectiveness when your envoy on freedom of, well, first of all, when you call your envoy on freedom of religion or belief, religious freedom, why not stick to the human rights language unless there's a good rationale for it, first point. And secondly, if you cannot, in diplomacy, often you can start with your own domestic experience and say, yeah, terrorism and imprisonment, we face these challenges. However, we have trained our police force and et cetera, et cetera. So starting from that point of not empathy exactly, but experience to open the door to conversations, to then bring them on board. So, I'm not a diplomat, but I think you miss many opportunities for conversation openers rather than just resistance. You're here as a foreign policy envoy, not as somebody that is grappling with these issues of intolerance and discrimination domestically. It doesn't help.
Okay, thanks so much. So we'll take Lena's question, and then Jonathan, I saw you have something in the chat, so we'll take your question after that. So Lena first, and then Jonathan.
Thank you, Professor Wolf, and thank you, Ambassador Rapp and Dr. Ghanea, for a wonderful conversation. My name is Lena. I'm a Master of Public Policy student at the Blavatnik. I'm originally from Afghanistan. So I have a situation here, and I think after telling the situation, I may try to form my question exactly what it is, because I'm not really sure how to put it right now. So in Afghanistan, we have the Hazara group, and over the country has said this is a minority group. It's a minority Shia group. While most Hazaras are Shia, there are Hazaras who are Sunni, there are Hazaras who are non-religious, there are Hazaras who are Christians. But in the way what's happening in Afghanistan is that by calling it a minority religious group, it is kind of minimizing the harm that this ethnic group is facing. So, for example, every time an attack happens on the Hazaras, it's reported as the Shia minority. So when you say Shia minority, it excludes all the other Hazaras who are not part of the Shia minority. And at the same time, for example, when the Taliban stops a bus on the way, when they look at you and find a Hazara, they stop you because of your Oriental features, and they take you and kill you. It's not necessarily because of your religion, Shia again. So in this way, I'm just trying to understand how, by calling something religious minority, it may also push to this borderline of marginalization as well, and kind of minimize also the harm of it. And then the other point in regards of Afghanistan and Hazaras in Afghanistan is that people don't actually know the population of how big Hazaras are. So the country keeps saying it's 10%, but because there was genocide during Abdurrahman Khan and 1800s, and then another one in 1998 by the Taliban, we don't really know how big the group is. So the country keeps saying, yeah, you're a minority and you're 10%, but the truth could be it's not 10%, it could be 25%, 30%, but yet we still don't know. So any thoughts on that regard is welcome. Sorry that I took so much time. Thank you.
It's so interesting. I mean, these definitions and categories in human rights law are only in order to assist and advance the enjoyment of human rights, but they backfire, right? And there's been a huge resistance to the term minority in many parts of the world, including that, the term minority in, the Middle East and beyond diminishes them. So you're either a minority or you're a citizen. You're either entitled to citizenship rights and equal rights, or you're a minority. So, if you're a minority, then you can be played with. It's a tokenistic. We will put one of you as foreign minister, and the rest of you we can massively discriminate. We will categorize you. You cannot change religion or belief. I mean, who says that just because you belong to a religious minority, suddenly your right to freedom of religion or belief, which includes change of religion or belief, or no compulsion, suddenly is compromised. So, you know, it becomes counterproductive. And I think nobody should be made to be compelled to declare their religion or belief. Minorities depends on, and indigeneity for that matter, depends on self-definition, and you can choose not to define. And in any case, your full humanity with equal dignity and equal rights is not a category that if the Hazaras are 20%, then they are entitled to human rights. And if they are 10%, they're not. It forgets the whole purpose of human rights, that it is a birthright, an equal birthright for all, and that it's an entitlement to all human rights, to enjoyment of all human rights. Not only if you're a religious minority, you only have freedom of religion or belief, you also have the right not to be tortured. So yes, this is where the categories backfire, because everybody's lost the plot, which is about advancing human rights and its enjoyment. So thanks for that.
Yeah, let me, I think it's a very perceptive question. And I think, obviously we bought into this nomenclature, and I guess we're perhaps stuck with it. Frankly, in the human rights context, the minority term doesn't appear, to my knowledge, in international criminal law. You're taking action against a religious, national, ethnic group or political group in the case of persecution. And they can even be a majority group. Actions by, say, Yugoslav forces in Kosovo were against majority Muslim, majority Albanian Kosovar nationalities. They were more powerful, but they were not dominant. And this sort of throwing in of non-dominant is kind of thing that, we often tended to view women's rights as to some extent minority rights. And of course, pedants would immediately say, well, women are 53%, not a minority, but they're obviously non-dominant and discriminated against and generally in the world. And so thinking in terms of the minority is automatically the ones that are suffering, well, maybe because they're outvoted, but that's not always the case. And so that term maybe is not something we should deal with. On the other hand, there's no question that when the large majority decides that a smaller group is a group that it's being threatened by, which seems insane, then you really do have to watch out. I mean, it is ludicrous to think that Jews were threatening Hitler, or that Tutsis in Rwanda were threatening Hutus. But when the majority group thinks it is being oppressed and takes action, then you see the worst crimes in the world. And so, but not that a small minority is in power can't, say, I won't call it religious policy at all, but obviously, as a leader like Assad is Alawite, a small minority, feels threatened in the position in a Sunni-led country, et cetera. And obviously, that's one of the reasons that he's committed such horrible crimes to stay in power. And so, these are all thinking about these things in majority ways, I think probably really isn't useful. We should be thinking in terms of dominant instead, but maybe we're just stuck with that nomenclature in human rights law.
I think maybe there's a simpler rationale for minority rights, and that is that there are certain characteristics that will not survive if there isn't special attention given to them. So, if you speak English in the UK, your children will learn English. My kids are half Iranian, they will not necessarily learn Persian. I haven't gone and asked the public purse to pay for them to learn Persian, but I'm just saying that there are certain characteristics that the majorities in a society can ensure continuity and support for, but it's not a level playing field for those characteristics to be able to survive if special attention is not given to them. It is not meant to be more than that a privilege that you utilize in order to get to power or to squash the others, etc. Of course, there comes in all these identity battles and political games and culture wars that don't sit comfortably with minority rights. But I think the rationale of minority rights in human rights law is quite simple and perhaps digestible.
Yeah, and it makes sense in a democratic sense, or in limited government sense, where majorities, by 51%, you can't just run roughshod over the whole country, and you have to respect smaller groups. And indeed, I mean, one of the slogans in the genocide was we have to look out for the rights of the Rwandan and Wichi, which were the majority people, and all of the parties that were associated with the majority Hutus called themselves coalitions for the Republic, which meant, in other words, we 85% run the country, et cetera. And this effort, this majoritarian idea to drive out and to marginalize, in the end, to destroy this minority, was in part a failure to have a system which gave that minority a stake in the democratic process and assured that its group rights weren't violated.
Okay. This is so interesting, and it ties in so much, Stephen, with the comments you made about the way in which religious freedom is being presented in Trump, or was presented in Trump's America, as the freedom of those who are already in power and dominant. But let us move on. We've got not a lot of time, but we've got a couple more questions. We've got Jonathan first, and then Matthias. So Jonathan, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Similar sort of question, but approaching it from a different angle. So Nazila noted that, just finding my own question again. Yeah, that one of the grounds for state limitation of the manifestation of religion or belief is the protection of public morals. And I just wondered whether there have been any leading cases, for example, in the European Court of Human Rights, where that specific issue, that specific concept was actually at stake. For example, where a minority claim to manifestation was seen to conflict with something like majority public morals. I mean, it seems one of the most inherently problematic of the grounds, by comparison to, say, public safety, which is much more easily established. So if so, how have the courts actually determined what counts as public morals?
I think there's one normative clue, and that is that the Human Rights Committee in General Comment 22 and 34 has said that public morals cannot stem from a single tradition. It must be from several traditions. And I think that's at least very helpful, because it says that this is not the back door for restricting manifestation if it doesn't suit the state religion or the state majority, etc. And there also, scholars have said that really we should collapse the limitation grounds just to the rights and freedoms of others. And if the state has to limit manifestation, then it needs to justify necessary, proportionate, non-discriminatory, etc. And rights and freedoms of others, encompasses the other grounds and is much more helpful. And I'm quite persuaded by that, but we are stuck with the articulation we have, and we're a bit reluctant to reopen the language of the ICCPR, because there would be a huge risk there. But maybe that's my brief response.
Okay, so let us move to Matthias, and then I see Jonas has raised his hand as well. So Matthias, to you, please.
Well, one example for Western Europe, maybe you have read the question. In our German region where I live, we have a discussion currently. Muezzin call. Well, if Muslims would go to the Court of Human Rights with that claim, would they be successful?
So the claim,
successful?
The claim is that the
call to prayer.
Right.
That should, yes, okay.
Okay. Nazila.
Sure. So, I mean, if we were sticking to the freedom of religion or belief, then it's a manifestation. I think it would be uncontroversial that this is worship as part of freedom of religion or belief, and that this is a public manifestation, that there's a call to prayer. Could it be limited on the grounds on the rights and freedoms of others? I think these things have to be case by case, and I think it is democracy in some ways has already failed if we have to take this to court. So, I mean, if there can be, first of all, if there are general neighborhood zoning regulations in an area where people reside, then maybe there will be a general regulation on sound, and it would apply equally to church bells and as the call to prayer. And then proximity to housing, etc., that all of those would be considered. But perhaps it could be at the neighborhood level that there are consultations about, perhaps there can be the call to prayer 5 times a day, but that it can only be loud on a Friday once a week, and the others it's low enough that it is practiced, yet it is not disturbing a neighborhood where people are living close to that and might be disturbed by the sound. But if it is in an area, in an industrial area, let's say, then why can't there be a call to prayer? It shouldn't just be the fact that it offends the sensibilities of others. There needs to be a rights grounds for a rights limitation. But yes, I think maybe in consultation, there can be sensible, non-discriminatory ways that allow both respect for the sounds limitations as well as the practice.
It reminds me a little of in America, where our First Amendment rights are generally viewed as much stronger even than Article 19 of the ICCPR in terms of free expression. The US doesn't have an Article 20, which authorizes prosecution of hate speech, for instance. And technically the law says Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of press or speech. On the other hand, our Congress says there can be reasonable restrictions in terms of time and place, and et cetera. So you can make the demonstrators all demonstrate in the demonstration area, et cetera. You can require a permit so that it doesn't block traffic at particular times, et cetera. As long as you don't restrain as long as they have that exercise, as long as they have that ability to be heard, as long as it's not, but if it's 10 miles away from the Capitol, that's no good, et cetera. So you have these sort of shades of gray, but as a general rule, you do then sometimes have these challenges, and you get into questions about where you can protest an abortion clinic and all of that, and you have to balance these things out, and that's in the nature of human rights law, and when different rights come up against each other.
Thank you.
So I think we should make Jonas's question the last, then I'll hand back to Marietta to finish us off. So Jonas, over to you.
Very much, and it's been really enjoyable. I'm actually going to tie into what Matthias asked, because I'm curious about these minor cases. Instead of sort of the genocide sort of proportion of things. And since Nazila, you started with giving examples from Europe. And of course, I know that this is monitored. I know this is reported about. I do know about some court cases about the veil. I know the court case in Greece where the state had to back down after being trampling the minority rights on self-determination of leadership. But are there sort of a million of different cases going on at the same time? Or are these just sort of a few cases that is possible to take on? Or, there are so many structures that we could address, like the broadband of Eastern Europe's tradition of only acknowledging some religions and then refusing rights to other religions. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses or Pentecostal groups or whatever, what have you. And then giving actually quite explicit rights to Muslims, like in Romania, but they're not upholding them, etc., etc., etc. There's so much. Or is this sort of is this a legal active part, or is this more theoretical that this can happen?
Okay.
There are all, I think, human rights violations. I wouldn't categorize them as minor. And I know that Stephen is operating, in a context where there might be millions of lives at stake. And of course, that is particularly grievous. But perhaps we should take every violation seriously so that hopefully it will not come to that. There are many cases around the world. I didn't want to suggest that the cases in Europe are the worst ones at all, but I was trying to draw from the ones that might be most familiar to a wide-ranging student body with wide-ranging interests. So I took those that might be in the public perception. If you want to certainly the European Court is overwhelmed by the number of cases that come to them, and Article 9 is no exception to that. And they often group them together in order to manage it. But on the global level, there are all categories of freedom of religion or belief cases. So it might be in relation to minorities within minorities. It might be in relation to employment and those that work in a faith school. It might be around, questions of conscientious objections. So, can you refuse as a pharmacist to give the morning after pill, or as a doctor to carry out an abortion? There's a whole range, and I'll refer to a book by OUP on freedom of religion or belief cases. So it has some 30 chapters. So and that's only a succinct reflection of some of the issues that arise. Prisoners' rights, can they have a beard? I mean, what about asylum seekers and their rights? There's all sorts of rights that emerge. Migrant workers, the rights of migrant work, the freedom of religion or belief rights of migrant workers are often ignored. When the Pope went to the United Arab Emirates, and it was, everybody said, and certainly I grew up in the region, it was true that was the first public acknowledgement that these migrant workers that make up 80-90% of the population also may want to practice a religion or belief, and that those are one of the many sets of their human rights that needs provision and facilities for it to be able to be enjoyed. So yes.
Okay. And can I just add for a moment in terms of how these things work together, and not to be in conflict. One of my good friends in the human rights field, Pablo de Graaf, who's recently been the human rights rapporteur on transitional justice, has launched an initiative on prevention of genocide through protection of human rights, but protection of all human rights, and recognizing that when you begin to deny the agency of others, minorities, other groups, other persons, and deny people dignity, and then begin to view those as others, you head down a slope which can, in these extreme situations and with manipulation and hate speech, lead to violence. And so all of these things are a continuum that we don't always go down all the way to the slippery slope, but if we don't protect each of them, we increase the danger of even more serious violations.
Fabulous. Well, this is an excellent way to end. I've really learned such a lot this evening. It's been excellent presentations and discussion. So thank you so much, Naz and Stephen. And let me pass back to Marietta just to finish things off for us tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thanks once more to Naz and to Stephen. So in 2 weeks' time, we have Professor Beatrice de Graaf join us for another Landecker seminar. Beatrice de Graaf is a professor in history and international relations. And one of the things we will be talking about is how minorities historically have been regulated on as a matter of security, and that it was only in the context of the formation of states as nation states that this problem kind of moved from a security problem to being a political/legal problem, which I think is very fascinating. She will bring us back to the Vienna Congress, so that's about 200 years ago, but with plenty of leads for conversation about counterterrorism today, and other discussions on security and the re-securitization, as it were, of the minority status. So most welcome to that. If you are not yet on the mailing list, please shoot me a message and I'll make sure that you are included. So the 1st of June at 5:30 British Summer Time, Beatrice de Graaf and a response by Federica D'Alessandro, who's been on the call today. So with that, I wish you all a very good evening, and till soon.